There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a field when a satellite connection drops. It isn't the quiet of a resting engine. It is the dead air of a permission slip being revoked. On Tuesday, the county heard that silence loud and clear. $500,000 of plastic and microchips sat dead in the rows, bricked by a server error 3 states away. But across the fence line, the ground was shaking. That was Joseph. And that sound wasn't a computer rebooting. It was a 1972 International 1466 waking up angry. They laughed at his scrap pile for years. But to understand why he was the only man moving when the storm rolled in, you have to look at what he built in the dark. Joseph wasn't a farmer who fixed things. He was a master mechanic who happened to put corn in the ground. A farmer looks at a tractor and sees a way to get a job done. A mechanic looks at a tractor and sees a collection of tolerances, heat cycles, and potential failure points. If you walked into his shop, you wouldn't find a clean floor or a diagnostic laptop. You would find the heavy, sweet smell of 80W90 gear oil and the blue haze of welding smoke hanging in the rafters. The air felt heavy, like it held the weight of the iron sitting on the jack stands. He operated on a simple rule, one that the dealership salesman called backward and Joseph called sovereignty. The rule was this: if you cannot fix it with a wrench, a torch, and a hammer, you do not own it. You are just a temporary custodian of a machine that answers to someone else. He looked at the modern rows of green and red plastic sitting in his neighbor's driveways, machines that needed a software key just to prime the fuel system, and he didn't see progress. He saw a trap. He saw appliances. To Joseph, a tractor wasn't an iPad with wheels. It was an engine that converted diesel fuel into torque through a mechanical driveline. It was about heavy clutches that took a strong left leg to operate. It was about manual linkages that vibrated in your hand so you could feel exactly when the gear engaged. The neighbors called him stubborn. They said he was living in the past, holding on to junk that should have been melted down for rebar. They watched him spending his evenings covered in grease, wrestling with a seized axle housing, and they pitied him. They sat in their air-conditioned cabs with air-ride seats, watching Netflix while the auto-steer did the work, and they thought they had won the game. They thought they had bought efficiency. Joseph knew they had only bought comfort, and the price of that comfort was control. He kept his shop organized in a way that only made sense to him. Rows of coffee cans filled with grade 8 bolts, sorted not by size, but by the specific assembly they belonged to. A lathe in the corner that was older than his father, covered in brass shavings, ready to machine a bushing that you couldn't buy from a catalog anymore. This wasn't a hobby. It was a discipline. He knew that metal fatigues. He knew that seals dry out. He knew that every machine eventually tries to return to the earth as rust. The difference was, Joseph believed he could talk the metal out of quitting. He understood the language of the machine. He knew that a slight tick in the valve train meant the lash was loose, not that a sensor was glitching. He knew that a change in exhaust temperature meant the engine was working hard, not that a computer needed an update. He lived in the physical world, where actions had direct consequences, and where a man's ability to work didn't depend on a signal from space. He didn't build this philosophy because he was nostalgic for the good old days. He built it because he looked under the hood of the new iron, saw the wires and the black boxes, and recognized a weakness that nobody else wanted to admit was there. Joseph didn't build his arsenal at the dealership. He built it in the back rows of estate auctions, where the weeds had grown through the drawbars and the paint was faded to a chalky pink. He looked for the machines that the county had given up on, the orphans, that were too old to trade in and too broken to run. While the neighbors were signing leases on $250,000 units with heated leather seats, Joseph was dragging home carcasses on a flatbed trailer. He was buying iron that had lost its dignity but kept its structural integrity. Take the Case 1370 Agri-King he pulled out of a barn in 2018. It was a 1974 model, a beast of a machine in its day, but it had been parked for 15 years with a shattered power shift transmission. To a modern farmer, a bad power shift in an old Case is a death sentence. The labor cost to split the tractor exceeds the value of the metal. But Joseph didn't calculate labor costs. He calculated tolerances. He dragged that 1,370 into his shop, blocked up the frame with railroad ties, and split the tractor in two. It looked like an autopsy of a dinosaur. The rear end sat on one side of the shop, the engine on the other, and in between lay the guts of the transmission. Most men would see a hopeless mess of clutch packs and hydraulic lines. Joseph saw a puzzle that just needed patience. He spent 3 weeks of nights inside that transmission housing. He found the C1 clutch pack was fused together, the friction plates warped from heat and abuse. He didn't just order a replacement part from a catalog. He took the carrier to his lathe and machined the surface true again. He sourced heavy-duty friction discs meant for industrial earth movers, not farm tractors. He shimmed the packs until the clearance was measured in thousandths of an inch, checking it with a dial indicator until the needle stopped moving. When he finally rolled the two halves back together and torqued the bell housing bolts, that transmission wasn't just fixed, it was bulletproof. Then there was the International 1466 Black Stripe. He found it in a hedgerow, buried under 20 years of brambles and neglect. The engine was seized solid, the pistons rusted to the cylinder walls. The previous owner had laughed when Joseph offered scrap price for it, saying the motor was a boat anchor. Joseph knew better. He knew the DT436 engine inside that frame was a wet sleeve design. You didn't have to bore the block, you just had to knock the old sleeves out. He spent a week with a sledgehammer and a custom-made puller, driving out the rusted liners until the block was empty and clean. He dropped in new sleeves, new pistons, and new rings. When he finally bled the injector lines and hit the starter, the 1466 didn't just turn over, it erupted. A column of black smoke hit the rafters, and the engine settled into a heavy, rhythmic idle that you could feel in the soles of your boots. He did this 10 times over. He built a ghost fleet of specific machines, each chosen for a specific strength. There was an Oliver 1855, with a cooling system redesigned to stop it from overheating. There was an Alice Chalmers 7060, with the rear end reinforced to handle heavy tillage. Each tractor had a fatal flaw from the factory, and Joseph had cured every single one of them. He knew the torque specs of every head bolt in that shed. He knew which hydraulic pump whined when it was cold, and which one needed 5 minutes to warm up. The neighbors drove past his place and saw a junkyard. They saw a collection of rust and oil leaks. They made jokes at the coffee shop about Joseph running a museum instead of a farm. They didn't understand that they were looking at a strategic reserve. They saw old paint. Joseph saw iron that had already survived the test of time. He knew that when the sensors on their plastic spaceships failed, his mechanical linkages would still be solid steel. They saw a man living in the past, but Joseph was the only one preparing for a future where the internet didn't work. To the boys running the sections north of the creek, Joseph was a cautionary tale. They looked at his operation through the tinted, soundproof glass of their climate-controlled cabs and shook their heads. They called themselves producers, not farmers. They didn't drive tractors, they managed systems. When they climbed into their machines, they weren't stepping onto a platform of steel and rubber. They were entering an executive suite. The air was filtered, the seat was heated, and the steering wheel was just a suggestion. They punched coordinates into a touchscreen, engaged the auto steer, and let the satellites drive the rows while they checked grain markets on their phones. They called it efficiency. They pointed to the yield maps generated in real time, the precise application of fertilizer down to the inch, and the way the transmission shifted without the operator ever touching a lever. It was impressive engineering, if you like that sort of thing. It was clean. It was quiet. It was comfortable. But Joseph looked at those machines and saw something else entirely. He saw a leash. You see, when you buy a piece of modern iron, you aren't buying a tool. You are buying a subscription to a service plan. You are signing a contract that says you can turn the key, but you can't look under the hood. The engine is buried under plastic shrouds, and the computer is locked behind encryption that would make a banker blush. If a sensor fails, a $50 piece of plastic made in a factory you've never heard of, that $500,000 machine doesn't just run rough, it stops. It goes into limp mode, derating the engine to an idle speed that won't pull a plow through a sandbox, let alone a chisel through hard-pan clay. And you can't fix it. You can't bypass it with a jumper wire. You can't trick it with a resistor. You have to call the dealership. You have to wait for a technician with a proprietary laptop and a special cable to drive out to your field, plug into the diagnostic port, and clear the code. You are tethered to a support network that operates on business hours, while the harvest operates on weather hours. Joseph saw this play out on a Tuesday afternoon with young Miller, the neighbor whose family farmed 3,000 acres of prime bottomland. Miller was leaning against the tire of a brand new quad track, a machine that cost more than Joseph's entire farm. The hood was up, but Miller wasn't working on it. He was just staring at it, clean hands in his pockets, kicking the dirt. Joseph pulled up in his service truck, a rusted Ford that rattled but always started, and rolled down the window. He was covered in grease up to his elbows, smelling like diesel and sweat. "She quit on you?" Joseph asked, nodding at the silent behemoth. Miller spat on the ground. "DEF quality sensor. Computer thinks the fluid is bad. It's brand new fluid. I just filled it this morning. But the sensor says no, so the ECU shut down the injectors. I'm dead in the water." "Got a wrench?" Joseph asked, though he knew the answer. "Wrench won't help," Miller said, looking at Joseph like he was simple. "It's a software lockout. Dealer says they can't get a tech out here until Thursday." "Thursday, Joseph. The forecast says 2 inches of rain on Friday." Joseph looked at the sky. The clouds were already banking in the west, heavy and dark, the kind of bruised purple that means wind and hail. He looked back at the silent tractor. It was physically perfect. The pistons were sound, the transmission was solid, the hydraulics were tight. But it was paralyzed by a line of code. It was a hostage situation. "Thursday is too late," Joseph said quietly. "Tell me about it," Miller snapped. "But what am I supposed to do? It's not like your old junk. I can't just hit it with a hammer." "No," Joseph agreed, putting his truck in gear. "You can't. My old junk is loud, hot, and it rides like a brick. But when I turn the key, it asks for fuel, not permission." He drove off, leaving Miller standing in the shadow of his shiny, useless paint. The neighbors thought they had bought the future. They thought the shiny paint meant security. They didn't realize that by trading mechanical linkages for digital sensors, they had traded their independence for a tether. They had built a system that worked perfectly, right up until the moment it didn't. And as the humidity climbed and the barometer dropped, that tether was about to pull tight around the entire county's neck. The harvest window was closing, snapping shut like a steel trap, and the only thing standing between the crop and the storm was the ability to keep the wheels turning. Joseph knew the physics of the situation. Rust doesn't glitch. Iron doesn't need a firmware update. And when the sky turns green, you don't want a machine that needs to phone home. It started on a Tuesday, right around 9 o'clock in the morning. The sky was already turning that sick, bruised shade of green that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The humidity was so thick you could practically chew it, and the barometer was dropping like a stone. But the storm wasn't the problem yet. The problem was the update. It was a mandatory firmware patch pushed out by the manufacturer, a critical security handshake for the Tier 4 emissions control modules. It was supposed to happen in the background, a seamless stream of data between the tractor's ECU and a server farm 3 states away. But the handshake failed. Somewhere in the thousands of lines of code, a certificate expired, or a bracket was missed, and the system panicked. Across 3 counties, the screens in the cabs didn't just flicker, they went red. Critical fault, emissions data corrupted, limp mode engaged. Just like that, $10 million of high-tech equipment turned into lawn ornaments. It wasn't a blown head gasket. It wasn't a spun bearing or a snapped PTO shaft. It was a 0 and a 1 in the wrong order. The silence that followed was heavy. You could hear it rolling across the fields. The deep, consistent roar of high-horsepower diesels working under load was replaced by the pathetic, high-pitched whine of engines derated to idle. Men who prided themselves on efficiency were suddenly screaming at dealership receptionists who didn't have answers. The service managers were drowning. They had 4 technicians for 300 dead tractors, and every single one of them needed a proprietary laptop to clear the code. Joseph was in his shop when the silence hit. He didn't have a radio on. He was listening to the wind changing direction, feeling the pressure drop in his sinuses. He walked to the bay door and looked out. The neighbors' fields were static. Giant, articulated four-wheel drive machines were parked mid-row, headers down, looking like beached whales. They were physically perfect. The pistons were sound, the transmissions were solid, the hydraulics were tight. But they were paralyzed by a safety algorithm, designed by someone who had never smelled rain coming across a cornfield. He walked back to the 1466. He checked the oil, the dipstick showing black and steady. He checked the coolant. He climbed into the cab. No air conditioning, just a heavy steel door and a fan bolted to the ROPS. He turned the key. The solenoid clicked, the starter engaged, and 436 cubic inches of cast iron roared to life. It didn't ask for a password. It didn't look for a signal. It had a mechanical governor and a mechanical injection pump. As long as there was fuel in the tank and air in the intake, it would run until the rods came out the side of the block. The storm was 2 hours out. The radar showed a wall of red, hail, straight-line winds, the kind of lodging event that flattens corn against the mud. If that crop was still standing when the front hit, it would be a total loss. You can't combine corn that's laying flat in the mud without breaking the machine. The neighbors knew this. That's why the panic was setting in. They had the horsepower, they had the technology, but they didn't have permission to use it. Joseph watched a service truck blow past his driveway doing 80, lights flashing. It wasn't stopping for him. It was heading to the big corporate operation down the road. But Joseph knew the math. One technician can fix maybe 3 software lockouts in an hour if he's fast. There were hundreds of machines down. The math didn't work. The shiny paint had promised them efficiency, but when the chips were down, literally, it delivered vulnerability. The wind picked up, whipping dust across the yard. The first drops of rain hit the tin roof of the shed, big, heavy drops that sounded like gravel. Joseph didn't rush. He didn't panic. He grabbed his grease gun and gave the loader pivots 3 pumps each. He was calm because his preparedness wasn't stored in a cloud. It was stored in the torque of a bolt and the viscosity of the oil. The county was paralyzed by code, but Joseph's fleet ran on diesel and physics. The storm front was a wall of charcoal gray pushing down from the northwest, churning like a bruised ocean. But the sound rising from Joseph's shed wasn't thunder. It was the synchronized, mechanical roar of high-compression diesel engines running at wide-open throttle. He didn't just fire up the 1466. He woke the whole fleet. The International 1480 Combine, a machine built when Reagan was in the White House, belched a cloud of black smoke and settled into a steady, threshing hum. The International 1466, hooked to the gravity wagon, idled with that distinct, rattling clatter that sounds like a box of rocks, but pulls like a freight train. Behind them, the Case 1370 was staged with the chisel plow, ready to turn the stalks under the moment the ground was clear. Inside the cab of the 1480, there was no air suspension to float the operator over the ruts. You felt every lug of the tires through the base of your spine, a physical connection to the terrain that modern seats tried to erase. The steering wheel was a hard plastic ring that transferred the vibration of the hydraulic pump directly into your forearms. The air conditioning had quit in 1998, so the door was propped open, letting in the smell of chopped stalks, dust, and the ozone of the impending rain. It was loud, a deafening mechanical roar of chains, augers, and cylinders spinning at 1,000 RPM just inches behind the seat. The heat from the transmission tunnel radiated up through the floor mat, cooking the soles of Joseph's boots. But it was music to him. It was the sound of work being done, not processed. The neighbors lined the fence rows, leaning against the tires of their paralyzed $500,000 sculptures. They watched with a mix of confusion and something that looked a lot like jealousy. Their machines were quiet, locked in park by a safety protocol they couldn't override and a server they couldn't reach. They had the horsepower, but they didn't have the authority. They watched Joseph's scrap metal tear into the first rows of standing corn. The old combine wasn't fast. It didn't have a yield monitor mapping the field in high definition. But the golden stream of corn pouring into the hopper was real. It was physical. And it was the only grain moving in the entire county. Then it happened. On the third pass, just as the wind began to whip the tops of the stalks, a hydraulic hose on the header lift gave up. It was a main pressure line, fatigued by years of sun and pressure cycles. It blew with a wet pop that sprayed hot hydraulic fluid across the windshield of the cab. The header dropped like a stone, digging into the mud. The harvest stopped dead. From the fence line, Miller pointed. You could see the relief on his face. See, he seemed to be saying. The junk broke. He's done. In Miller's world, a blown main hydraulic line was a service call. It was a part number you had to order. It was a 2-day wait for a crimped hose from the distributor. It was game over. Joseph didn't pick up a phone. He killed the engine and grabbed a canvas tool roll from behind the seat. He jumped down into the mud, the wind tearing at his cap. He didn't look at the sky. He looked at the fitting. It was a standard JIC 37-degree flare, 3/4 inch. He knew that because he had plumbed it himself. He walked to the service truck, not with the frantic pace of a man in a panic, but with the deliberate stride of a mechanic who knows the inventory. He pulled a coil of bulk hose and a box of field-serviceable fittings from the bed. He didn't need a laptop to diagnose the flow rate. He didn't need a technician to calibrate the pressure sensor. He needed 2 wrenches, a 1 1/8 and a 1 inch. He cut the blown section out with a pocket knife, threaded the new collar on, and tightened the mandrel into the hose. It took raw hand strength. It took grit. The hot oil burned his knuckles, and the dust stuck to the fluid on his arms, turning his skin into sandpaper. 15 minutes. That's what it took. Miller was still watching from the fence, waiting for the tow truck that wasn't coming. Instead, he saw Joseph climb back into the cab, wipe his greasy hands on his jeans, and turn the key. The diesel smoke puffed black, the header lifted out of the mud, and the reel started spinning. The junk wasn't dead. It was just maintained. Joseph engaged the separator, and the golden stream started flowing again. He wasn't just harvesting corn. He was proving a point about survival. The rain arrived like a judgment. It didn't start with a sprinkle. It started with a wall of water and wind that hit 60 miles an hour. It flattened the neighbor's standing corn into a matted, muddy mess that no combine header could lift. The stalks were snapped at the brace roots, creating a harvest loss that would take years to recover from. But across the fence, Joseph's fields were stubble. The grain was in the bin, dry and safe, before the first hailstone dented the tin roof of the machine shed. He slid the heavy barn doors shut, latching them against the gale, while the $500,000 smart tractors sat outside, their sensors blind and their screens dark, weathering the storm they were supposed to beat. The rain didn't care about their heated seats or sub-inch accuracy. It only cared that they weren't moving. When the sun finally broke through 2 days later, the silence in the county had changed texture. It wasn't the silence of a glitch anymore. It was the silence of regret. The dealer service trucks finally arrived in a convoy, technicians swarming over the bricked machines with laptops and satellite uplinks. They cleared the codes. They updated the firmware. They got the engines running again. But it didn't matter. The crop was on the ground. The efficiency algorithms hadn't accounted for the one variable that matters: gravity. Joseph didn't drive into town to gloat. He didn't sit at the diner counter and tell them, "I told you so." He stayed in the shop. He had work to do. He walked around the 1466 with a grease gun, the lever action making a wet shh, click sound as he hit the zerks on the wide front end. He checked the oil in the final drives. He tightened the alternator belt that had squealed a bit under the load of the lights. He drained the water separator, watching the clear diesel float on top of the contaminants, knowing that simple glass bowl told him more than any digital dashboard ever could. He wasn't celebrating a victory. He was honoring the pact. The machines had taken care of him, so he took care of the machines. The attitude in the valley shifted that week. The jokes about the junkyard stopped cold. Men who had spent the last decade leasing the newest models started pulling up to Joseph's fence line. They didn't look at the faded paint with pity anymore. They looked at the injection pump with curiosity. One neighbor, a guy who had laughed the loudest at the old case, asked Joseph where he sourced his clutch discs. He asked if you really needed a computer to time a mechanical diesel. He was asking the wrong questions, of course. He was asking about parts when he should have been asking about philosophy. They had bought the lie that newer meant better. They thought reliability was a warranty claim. Joseph showed them that reliability is a function of simplicity. They were beginning to understand the difference between a user and an owner. A user pays for the privilege of operating a machine until the manufacturer decides otherwise. An owner understands the internal combustion cycle. Joseph's fleet was tired. The hydraulic fluid was dark, the tires were worn, and the cab smelled like sweat and old dust. But they were ready for next year. Right now. They didn't need a renewal fee. They didn't need a permission slip. They just needed a man who knew how to bleed the lines. The paint might be faded, but the iron doesn't lie. The shed is quiet now. The only sound is the ticking of hot cast iron contracting in the cool air. If you believe in keeping the old iron running when the world tries to turn it off, subscribe. Because you have to ask yourself, who really owns the farm? The man holding the wrench or the company holding the code?